All right, welcome everybody to the Controversial Exchange. Super fun topic today. We have two guests. We're going to jump in straight into letting them introduce themselves. First of all, Anita, welcome. Can you tell everyone who you are, what you do?
Oneida Sanchez is my name. I work in the field as a BCBA, living currently in the state of Florida, Miami. I moved recently from California. I lived there for 3 years. I practiced as a BCBA there as well.
All right, sweet. And Shane Spiker.
A beautiful place. I guess you went to another beautiful place, but
I did. They're basically the same place on just two opposite sides of the country.
Have you played the Florida Man game?
No, it's not.
If you look up your birthday and you say Florida Man and your birthday, that's your specific crime, and there's going to definitely be something absurd. Like mine, like some guy robbed the place on meth without pants on. I think it's like so. Anyway, should check out the game. It's fun.
I'll try it.
Mine ended up being that I won, like some guy won the lottery accidentally. Like found a lottery ticket and won the lottery. It's like literally the worst Florida Man example, but also the most wholesome.
But the best one.
Yeah. Right? Oh, it's great.
So that's the voice of Shane. Can we get Shane to introduce himself? What's up, man?
So I'm Shane. Hey, everyone. Straight white dude, lives in the United States. I have literally all the privilege in the world, and I think that's an appropriate frame for what we're going to talk about today.
So the goal of today is along the journeys of creating content and stuff, I've met a bunch of cool folks. We were all chatting at some point, I think in AVI, and you all did a panel on this at the Association of Behavior Analysis International's event. Can you maybe set some context as to what the panel was and what you discussed there?
Yeah, go ahead, Anita.
Me? Okay. Well, I mean, basically the panel was about the same exact topic. We're trying to bring awareness to just multicultural implications in the field. It was an open conversation where we discussed potential things that analysts could do in the field, organizations, and even, our governing body as well.
It's super timely. Yeah. Like with everything going on, like we definitely wanted to talk on this idea of how culture influences our field and kind of give more of a functional approach to addressing this type of thing, which I think people talk about it a lot. And I think it is definitely one of those things that's kind of this undercurrent of behavior analysis, but I think we have a hard time talking about it in a way that's useful.
So as the last setup thing, we have some guideposts that we'll hit today. I'm going to kind of work them backwards. I don't know what order we're going to go in, but we're going to talk about a court case happened in California. We're going to talk about developing cultural awareness and what that looks like in one of the specific articles by Fong et al. We're going to also talk about just generally what are the implications of people being impacted because of issues like this. But we're going to start with just the general, what it is and why does it matter. So who wants to start us off there?
I'll start.
All right.
Should I be? Well, actually, I think we kind of touched on it earlier. I wanted to ask, before we start, what is everyone's ethnic background? Ethnicity? Can I ask
Shane?
that question?
Yeah, so I am probably I'm waiting on some genetic results to come back, but I'm pretty sure I'm literally as white as possible. So I think Irish, German, and a bit Scandinavian. So that's a lot of where I come from. I'm a straight male, identify as cisgender, and that's kind of my whole background. Atheist, so maybe that's the only one that gets a little bit discriminated against, but even then, nobody really gives a shit about that anymore. So
yeah.
Sure.
So straight male, cisgender. Also atheist, don't get shit for that. Agnostic maybe is a better term actually there. I don't spend time thinking and behaving in directions of that. But I'm not like opposed to anybody's position on it or whatnot. For my breakdown, I actually do have it. I'm looking at here, my breakdown. So I recently did one of the 23andMe's. I am 99.9% European, which is basically like 100%. They're just leaving a little bit of room in case there's some sort of error there. It breaks down into British and Irish, 47%, French and German, 23%, a little bit of Scandinavian, Northwestern, European, But yeah, 100% white, 100% white.
I'm Greek descent. My first generation, I guess. So that's ethnically, I come from a multi-generational household, multilingual household. Yeah, that's my ethnic background.
Nice. So do you speak fluently?
I do. I lived there. My dad retired early, and he moved us back there, and I lived there for 5 years, and actually went to public school there and did middle school in Greece. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So you okay?
Yeah.
Well, I asked that question because I know we said culture, right? But culture encompasses so many different things. I think that you can kind of go down the rabbit hole of different types of cultures, right? You can focus on ethnicity, on race, on gender, on sexual orientation. I mean, you can go down the rabbit hole on single mothers, all of that. So I myself, being Puerto Rican, fourth generation, born in Chicago, raised in Miami, I look Hispanic, right? I look Puerto Rican. I have the curly hair, the brown skin. I'm most impacted by the ethnic aspect of culture, the racial aspect of culture, right? Because I look a certain way when we're talking about race, and I am of a specific ethnicity where I'm expected to follow certain rules, right, or expectations. And most importantly, I feel sometimes stereotyped, right? So I don't know if we wanted to kind of focus our conversation on what aspect of culture we wanted to talk about.
Well, I think maybe we should start with defining culture from a behavioral perspective. So how would we define culture or cultural contingencies as behaviorists?
Would you actually just linked a dope article for us that I hope every behavior analyst has read, with the Selection of Consequences by Skinner.
Exactly.
One of the only, or few, I think the only ones that he published in Science, like the pinnacle of all places to publish science. I highlighted a little bit. Do you want me to read one of the quotes he has out of there? So he says, page 502, a culture evolves when practices originating in this. Ooh, I need to stop back. Damn it. Sometimes I highlight things that I think are super important.
Bush League.
This is fucking second class, dude. Trusted you.
Rookie mistake.
I don't know if I want to quote. Let's see. I don't know if I love his quotes sometimes. They're so...
Just read a general definition so we have it, dude. I mean, it's just about...
So,
here we go. I'll read it and see what y'all's reactions are. All right?
Okay.
So he says, a culture evolves when practices originating in this way contribute to the success of the practicing group in solving its problems. He's talking about how your verbal behavior starts to shape up. And it is the effect on the group, not the reinforcing consequences for individual members, which is responsible for the evolution of a culture. And so my understanding is it's verbal behavior and the reinforcement contingencies moving off of the individual selection, but selecting for the group, for the group's best interests. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'll take it.
I don't know many people that are going to be like, nah, Skinner doesn't have it figured out.
No, yeah.
I mean, I think within that, though, I think that part of the issue that I see when people do talk about culture is that they forget to talk about cultural selection. Like, I think that people get so into the individual piece and they forget that cultural selection piece is even there. Like, and we forget that like language and rules and laws and those social contingencies are all part of that. Like that context, right? That cultural context that influences our behavior as a group of people.
And what's crazy to me is like no one's a part of one culture, I don't think, right? When you really dig down, like these things are overlapping and influencing in all these sort of different ways. So for a behavior analyst that's used to really, paying attention to a certain contingency stream, that's not how this goes. It's completely nonlinear. There's multiple things going on all the time.
I mean, look at the current culture of behavior analysis right now. You can go into do behavior analysis and look at that specific culture and look how like interesting it is and how there are these divides within it. I mean, there are specific cultures between like applied practitioners and experimental behavior analysts. Like those are entirely different cultures within themselves.
I struggle with some of the way that we go about using the word culture, because I understand from a technical point of view that we can talk about it in a variety of contexts or relative to a variety of traits or, specific identity issues. But I mean, I always go back to it in terms of ethnic identity, racial identity, and or like shared ethos. Like I think of like a nationalistic point of view when I think of the word culture. Like it seems like a shared collection of mores, beliefs, behaviors, and rituals, like amongst a particular community. And like the other thing is the other stuff, calling them culture, I understand how they would fit within that context or that definition, but just like in the vernacular, that's not necessarily how my brain would necessarily go to. Like my thoughts wouldn't go to those spheres. And I wonder if that's necessarily other people's experience or if that's just, I don't know, some shortcoming that maybe I just don't conceptualize it that way.
I have to agree with you. I think that when I bring up the topic, that's the first thing that comes up, right? They start talking about race, nationality, ethnicity, all of that, everything that I listed earlier.
Right.
Then we get into, but then there's a culture within a culture, within a culture, within a culture. It's inception of cultures. Like we get into that too.
The Russian doll of being.
Every precision teacher just identified with that. That's me. I love that community. I'm working on some projects in that area right now. But that's the first thing I thought of. Sorry. You were saying, Anita.
No, yeah, I agree with Dimitri on that one. I have to say that, again, I don't discredit other cultures. I'm not saying that they're not important to discuss. I know me myself, I'm more familiar with discussing race and ethnicity, and talking about it being like a hot topic. I mean, that's what's on the news. That's what's in the daytime talk shows. Everyone's talking about representation, right? Of color, of gender, of sexual orientation.
How do you think that we go about having a conversation about where culture fits and what we should be doing then? Because I think that's when we're getting because the point of this podcast or us sitting down and talking is going to be talking about awareness relative to the field and that kind of thing. We define cultural awareness. We kind of talked about where we're all coming from in that angle. But I mean, like, okay, where do we start even deciding that if we can technically go into an infinite regression? Because I mean, ultimately, if you do the Russian doll example and you accept it, you kind of get sucked down an infinite rabbit hole. And it's like, well, at some point, you hit a certain semblance of infinity. And that's a logical fallacy.
Yeah. So when I was kind of preparing for the podcast, what I was going through my mind was basically, what are most of us doing? We're providing in-home services to children diagnosed with autism. That's what most BCBAs, I think, are doing. I know I'm not quoting any literature here.
That's fair to say. If not in-home, let's just say working in DD.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fill in your setting.
Fill in the blank word.
Fill in person, place, or thing. Let's just.
Yeah.
It's over 85% is what the BACB sample said. Working with populations like that, and then if it's not that, then it's got some component of that, I think, for the most part.
Okay, so that takes me down my own rabbit hole, and it makes me think about, well, how was my practice impacted by culture in regards to that, right? And for me, it was based off of ethnicity, the communities, and the groups as such when I was working directly with the clients and when I was also working on staffing the clients. I guess for me, it goes like I would say living in Miami, although I was born in Chicago, I grew up with a culture that was very similar to my own. You know, we're talking about Caribbeans, I'm Puerto Rican, we all have kind of the same processes that we go through for the most part. So I didn't have to actively think about how I introduced myself, how my information was received, if I was communicating clearly. But when I moved over to California, it was like a whole new ball game for me. It looks the same, but it's completely different as far as you're culturally speaking, right? As far as ethnic backgrounds and racial identity. So
even the East Coast West Coast surf culture is different. Like those East Coast differences are so much different. I'm not.
Yeah, we don't do wetsuits over here. Nah, we don't need them.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I went to grad school and then stayed an extra year down in Florida, and so that East Coast West Coast thing I sometimes equated to like I didn't realize I was changing my life so much. I was like, you're gonna move from one side to the other side of the United States, and it was much more different than I thought it was.
Very, very different. Which I mean, again, like greetings, for instance, here you greet with a kiss on the cheek. Right? Male to female, even male to male, kiss on the cheek. Over there, it was like a high five or a hug. I had to stop myself and learn just little things like that, right? How I drafted an email even, I think was taken very different from here. It sounds so simple, but it was a very different experience. And I account that to ethnic differences in my experience. I don't know if you guys have come across, other than surf experience, that kind of interaction.
That's been Ryan's entire experience with culture. It's just been surfing.
Yeah. Just to clarify to everyone, I don't surf like that.
No.
Have you guys ever had anything like, I mean, not obviously you've had some stuff, but have you two ever had anything like that where you can even possibly identify with like what that feels like? Like you've never been pulled over or like.
I get pulled over and they're like, go on your way. I mean, so here's my thing is like, growing up in the South, like living in the Bible Belt, like people who look like me and people who like, you never had that issue. As a matter of fact, it was almost the opposite. Like I would get welcomed by people like, when people saw me and they thought that we were like brothers because like they would have some like SS tattoo or some shit. And you're like, no, dude, like I'm not trying to join your clan. I'm not trying to show up in a hood and I'm not trying to join some neo-Nazi party. As a matter of fact, like I was at my experience with that was at neo-Nazi protests. Is I would go to these protests because there's like Klan rallies all over Florida. Like there's a big Klan presence here.
Florida's ridiculous.
Florida's insane. So, but what I'll say
Florida man and your birthday, man.
That's it. So, but like, yeah, but I was like, I had skinheads in my face calling me a traitor because I was protesting them at like court hearings and stuff. And so like, I never had that experience. I couldn't even imagine. I don't even want to pretend to imagine what it's like to be discriminated against or have that type of issue where my ethnicity is the thing that is preventing me from something or just kind of working within that. Like I've never had that experience.
I grew up in a super small town, 2,500 people in central Nevada. A lot of mining culture and some government jobs out there. And never did I run into issues. It was predominantly white. Like it was in the culture of the town that I was in for many, not my family, not myself.
Have you ever seen it?
It was allowed. So
like institutionally?
No, what I was saying is like in the town that I was in, not my family, not how I was raised, not me, but it was actually socially acceptable. It was okay in school to describe people that were of different color by their race or ethnicity. Like it was literally like the black kid, the Mexican, that's what was said. And for me, like my parents were like, that's not how you treat people. The people with disabilities in certain aspects were what I ran into first. Is someone was a little bit different. My mom and dad were really good at teaching me, like, this is where religion did play a big role, I guess, in influencing me. It was like, just treat everyone how you want to be treated. A lot of like those things were passed on down from my family in different aspects. And for me, it was always like, I didn't realize that wasn't okay, in the sense of like that's how the whole world. I thought the whole world operated that way, I guess. Does that make sense?
And they do not.
Yeah, and so I kind of like left there realizing like, I guess in a sense of like, oh God, thank God, like not everybody does this, and that was like a small town thing, and that culture. But I was super lucky early on to have family that made sure to teach me of like things might be a little bit different where you grew up in different aspects of how people are treated, and we don't do that.
Annetta, I'm surprised that you founded California was. So are you saying it was like harder than Florida? You think, just because you had community there, or?
So no. Here's the thing. I think that there's certain nuances within different ethnic cultures that you don't recognize until you move out, right?
Oh,
and so yeah, you totally, I'm sure. And also I guess there's
the bubble. Like, I mean, I talk like my family, we talk about the Greek bubble. Like, it's a totally different like, it's just a different.
Exactly.
It is
a totally different animal. It's a totally different way of communicating with other people. And I want to say that you have to actively practice those cultural norms in order to make sure that you're not offending others, that you're not, kind of misspeaking, right, in a sense. And so I think that I have a unique perspective, I feel, from our group here, in that I've been on the receiving end of that, right? I've been on the receiving end of probably insensitive comments that are maybe not intentional, right? Mm-hmm. I like to think that all people are nice at the core, right? So they're not intentional, but they are insensitive, right? And why does that matter in this conversation is because, we're going into individuals' homes or talking to parents of children with disabilities. And so we should be actively aware of how to speak in the way that would not be offensive, right? That would not be perceived in the wrong way. Or we're not going to get that buy-in, first and foremost. We're not getting past day one.
I first ran into this in practice, like much more when I moved down to Florida. There's kind of two things that happened. Inadvertently, I moved into a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. And yeah. And for those that are listening, Anita was throwing her hands up. We're
not laughing at Puerto Rican people.
Yes. I got to be very clear on that.
I should have gone woo woo.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Someone's listening is like, why is he laughing?
And I was treated very nicely by my neighbors, but the first day that I went to, before I even unlocked the door for the place we were renting, I was confronted by a neighbor. I would call very aggressively, to the point that like he literally pulled up a shirt. There was 9mm tucked into his pocket. He said, "I run this neighborhood, and like, what are you doing here? Like, what's your plan?" And I was like, "I'm just going to school, and I'm Ryan, by the way, and like, I'm renting here now." And we turned out to be great buddies and friends. But it was like that happened, and I was like, "Whoa, this is a totally different place from Nevada and where I grew up." But then I found myself in a position where I was working with a lot of people that were from a whole bunch of different backgrounds that I was providing services to. And also, luckily, in my case, there was a bunch of staff that had those diverse backgrounds as well that I could just lean on. And I realized it took me, like, my first conversation with one of my supervisors at the time was just like, I am not going to get the rapport with the children that I need to be working with. And it was very clear that like I needed to rely as much as I possibly could on all the staff to implement everything that we were trying to do at the end of the day. And that's where I took my first lesson on like really stepping back, having a case, and learning those case manager skills. And in a sense, I think I was super lucky that I had that early on in my career too, of like, you provide your expertise where it is and you shut the hell up the rest of the time.
Yeah. I mean, and I think part of that too is like within that, you have to kind of take a step back and realize like how your own experience has colored your worldview. Like, and being aware of that piece, like I grew up, like I tell, like when I tell my story, like I'm the first doctor in my family. Like I'm the first one that like went into even graduating high school, let alone anything else. And so, you know, we grew up in like a lower middle class family. My parents worked hard as hell. And, you know, coming from that background, when I work with families that come from like a low socioeconomic status, like I can relate a little bit. I'm not going to ask them to go buy a bunch of reinforcers knowing that they probably are working paycheck to paycheck just to get to their next bill and keep their power on. Like, and that's one of those like those unspoken social rules that you can't really grasp until you're in it, or that you've come into contact with it, or just or either you have lived it or somebody is going to expose you to it. And unless you've been there, you don't know what it's like. And that, I think, is one of the most important discussions around this. Is you can study culture all day and you could talk about that, but that privilege piece is such a big part of this that I think is often left out in that conversation.
I mean, I have to disagree with one part.
Okay.
I don't think that you have to live it to know it. I think you have to be willing to expose yourself and to listen to people who are speaking on it. And I think that you have to, like Ryan did, seek out those community members that are aware of it, right? I think that it helps when you've lived it. It helps for you to just kind of naturally fall into the groove of things. But if you don't, that doesn't mean that you're a lost cause, right? Like that doesn't mean you can't practice ABA in that community because you don't understand them completely. That just means you need to educate yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, there's what's it? Was it Benjamin? Is it Benjamin Guren that wrote "How to Rethink Human Behavior"? And part of what he did is before he stepped into intervening into this community, he lived with an Aboriginal community for about a year before he did any sort of behavioral intervention, which is pretty extreme. But
it's like
that was
an
part of like
anthropological method.
yeah. But it was very much so like this idea of like living it to really get to grab as much of that social context, I guess, or that, you know, just understanding that piece. And so that's probably more what I meant. So I agree that maybe I misspoke on that point. Also, don't, you know, I don't like being called out on stuff like that. So you don't have to do that to me.
I have to say, like, one of the thing of going through this literature and just like these conversations that make me, again, uncomfortable is not the right word because I'm not uncomfortable. I'm just more like, I'm skeptical in terms of the gravity of which we really have to change the way that we approach this stuff, because how at what point is it just not people just interacting with other people, like, and then acknowledging that everyone is different in some capacity. Like my experience is going to be different than Ryan's experience, it's going to be different than Shane's, going to be different than Oneida's. Like looking at me, you see a white guy, you know, you would have no idea that I did translational stuff for my grandma that didn't speak English in a Kmart. I'm bilingual. I lived in a foreign country. My dad's accent is so thick. I mean, you need a translator just to get through, you know, the first 7 words of what he has to say. You know? So, I mean, like, you know, so, I mean, that's, so I find it difficult, I guess, coming from a place where I feel like I've seen a lot of difference, but not necessarily have had to deal with maybe the uniquely American racial part of it. I think is that I just, at some point, I just think like, why isn't this just people talking to people and getting to know each other and or meeting them where they are, regardless of what their personal experiences are in some capacity? Not to say, of course, our personal experiences shape who we are. That's, yes, behavior selected by consequences. Yes, all that stuff. But I mean, like, does it have to be such an active anthropological process like we just talked about? That's where I get a little bit off the rails with it, because at some point, isn't it an anthropological question and not a behavioral one? Like, when are we actually shifting disciplines?
I don't think it needs to be that intense, but I do I do feel like we have to be aware, and maybe kind of some background would help with that, right? Like we mentioned Larry P. versus Riles earlier.
Why don't you
some background knowledge. So that was a court case in the 1970s, right? So it was a long time ago. Basically, there was some disparities as far as representation of Black students being overly represented in disability classes. So there is about 66% of the students in these disability classes were Black. However, only 28% of the entire student population was Black, right? So what does this imply? We can go on and on about what it possibly implies, right? But they went to court. They found, oh, sorry, let me rewind. I don't know why I didn't mention this part.
Yeah.
What they were doing to place these students in these classes was completing IQ tests with them. So that's how they did it. That was just like the standardized method to placing students that were having troubles, having problem behaviors in their classroom settings into these disability classes. Back to the data, 66% were Black students. Only 28% of the entire population were Black students. There's overrepresentation going on here. They took this to court. They found that the IQ tests were standardized with, can we guess?
White
students.
kids, yeah. Usually white males.
Yep. So they decided to throw out the IQ test. You can no longer use the IQ test to place these students in these classrooms, right? Fast forward 25 years later, even till today, there's so much research out there showing that there's still overrepresentation of not just Black students, but Latino students, of minority students in these disability classes. Why is this happening?
Which is partially crazy because there's also data of how they're identified much, much later than the white male. And white
exactly. Yes.
right?
You have 6 years old. Yeah. 6 years old white, 7 years old Latino, 8 years old Black. So what, this is like confusing, right? Why do you think this is happening? We have to think of implicit biases, right? We have to think of practitioners not understanding the cultural norms of these ethnic groups.
Yeah,
and so,
there was like, I was studying IQ tests, and one of the things that they talked about was like when you show this picture of skiing, like there are people that couldn't answer that question even though they were intelligent because they don't know what skiing is.
Because they've never seen it before, right? So, there is many studies out there in different professions, right? We can look in the cognitive psychology research, we can look in the teaching research and speech pathology, all of that showing that there are some biases going on here with these ethnic minorities. So we do have to have this conversation because it's not just people interacting with people anymore. It's people with these implicit biases, people who do not understand the cultural norms, interacting and trying to, we're trying to help, right? We're trying to practice our science, but we may be, not fully understanding the entire picture.
The implicit biases part's been interesting to me. Forever ago, we did a piece on Why We Do What We Do, the podcast that we run on the side on implicit testing and such. One of the rabbit holes that I went down was some researchers at the University of Nevada, Reno, behavioral in nature, behavior analysts, not in your traditional sense per se, working more in the relational frame theory and ACT model. But what they were doing is trying to, and I'm not overgeneralizing what this was, but I'm simplifying it down into kind of a nutshell of what they've been working on for years. So just know it goes much deeper than that for anyone listening out there. But they were trying to figure out to what degree are these biases impacting medical treatment. And so there's a good medical program that shaped up here, and they're looking at what was going on there. And I know one thing that was really difficult is they're trying to figure out, okay, if we do find a bias, do we just implement a treatment that is in the sense of this person's no longer allowed to work with these sort of people? Like, what if we find biases with people that are starting or halfway through their medical program? Like, do we tell them, like, you're now no longer equipped to be able to work in here? Like, they were running in some serious issues of what happens if you do have these implicit biases, if they're truly implicit, and they're a part of your history. And there was extremely strong kickback from some of the people that were going through that study because they felt like what was happening is there's something that's out of their control that they're now being held partially responsible for. That was, in a sense, becoming part of their identity. where they're like, hey, because of this, they were using what they call the IRAP to measure these sort of things. And the idea is it's just measuring your brief, immediate relational responses is what's going on. And they would, test things like trying to get at whether or not you're racist towards a certain type of people. And if they found evidence of that, it was in a sense kind of labeling you as that person. So it was like, in a sense, kind of even studying and approaching it that way, pushing identities or trying to, it was kind of changing people's identities of themselves or asking them to. Does that make sense?
So
like, I don't even,
that would like be a total mindfuck.
Yeah. And it was, so it's kind of like, I didn't see where that goes necessarily. So it's like, where do you take that if that is true? And there's also a huge validation issue with a lot of those implicit tests as well.
So before we go to that, can we just briefly maybe give a loose definition of implicit bias for people listening so that we can have a shared understanding of the phrase rather than kind of like a loose colloquial understanding?
Yeah. Has anyone got one, or I can probably just pull it up?
Just like, you can even just give a loose interpretation of it. It's fine. I just want to make sure that it's not just, because one of the things that goes with these terms, I think when we talk about them in conversation, is that we use them as if they're shared assumptions, and that's not necessarily always the case.
I'm just going to pull the Wikipedia for something general. An implicit bias or implicit stereotype is the unconscious attribution of a particular quality, of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group. Implicit stereotypes are shaped by experience and based on learned associations between particular qualities and social categories, including race and or gender.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for clarifying that.
So where does it go?
Sir? So, I'm just intervening here.
Yes, do it. That's the point.
That's the point, yeah.
So yes,
no fear.
Again, you may lose, you have this fear of losing your identity, of basically being misunderstood if you take these tests. But once you have that knowledge, right, like you do have these implicit biases. For instance, we're talking about the school setting. These teachers may have implicit biases of minority children, Latino children, and the way they communicate. So in my household, we're loud. We talk with our hands. If you haven't noticed already, we talk with our hands. And, we kind of speak over each other and get louder to be heard and understood, right? So in the school
you're not
setting,
yelling, you're not talking.
Which also
exactly.
Great qualities for podcasts with groups of people too.
Yeah.
I want to be heard. So, this may be interpreted as a problem behavior, right? This may be seen as disruptive behavior in the classroom setting. However, this is just a child trying to participate, right? In the classroom setting. They're just trying to actively engage. If the teacher is not aware of that implicit bias, they may say, you need to go to the principal's office. You are too disruptive. We need to put you on an IEP. This is too much. This is too much for this classroom. Rather than recognizing, oh, wait, I might have a bias here. I may not fully understand this culture because I took XYZ training, for all the staff in the school. And now I'm aware that I need to just teach this child how to raise their hand, how to, like how to interact the way it's recommended in that school setting. And so you're not changing who you are by taking these exams. You're just recognizing that there's a gap that needs to be filled with information.
And I would agree with you on the awareness part is an important place to take that. What was making me uncomfortable is that line of research was actually asking the questions of, should we stop preventing people from being able to get into a certain place because of these biases?
Yeah.
And that seems nuts.
That's extreme.
That is too extreme. We rely first and foremost on our science, right?
And those are questions that they're like exploring. It's not like these are treatment things or decisions were being made. I want to be really clear to listeners out there.
Yeah.
As to where the things can go.
One thing
that
to
might
your example. Hold on. One thing to your example, Anita, because that's interesting that you bring up that example, because I feel like if you could have said a lot of things, but that is definitely one of the ones that I can say that I understand. So yeah, the loud thing, all that stuff. Man, what a great example of culture. I mean, I think that I think Mediterraneans and Latin people share that thing. At what point in time, though, with some of that stuff, especially when we're talking about cultural awareness, it's we talk about it from a singular directional point of view, like a unidirectional perspective a lot of times. And for me, I feel like it should be bidirectional though as well. Because in some of the literature we're talking about acculturation and the different degrees of acculturation. And if we're talking about, let's just take the classroom example, like there's different levels of acculturation, just like there's different layers of everything. At some point, don't you need to acculturate to what a classroom atmosphere requires, regardless of what those specific contingencies are that are playing on you? Like it could be argued that it's necessary in order to operate appropriately in a classroom that you need to check your loudness. And I'm saying that as someone who's been literally pulled into rooms and been told, you're incredibly loud and boisterous. And like, that's just how we do things. Like in my family, the only way you are heard is if you're screaming at the top of your fucking lungs and your face is red. Like until you're red, people don't think you're serious. So like the rage actually amplifies how much your voice matters. So like, so that's just my normal, our normal volume, our normal just communication. And like, that is totally unacceptable to most people who don't come from that kind of background, especially people who are used to sitting around dinner time and a lot of quiet silence talking about their day. So like, that's not my experience. However, I still need to navigate that world and check myself a little bit when it doesn't make sense to bring on that level of heaviness to them. Like sometimes you have to be countersensitive, I think too. Or is that, when I say something like that, I feel like people would hear that and think, well, your role as the professional is to always be the person who's being accommodating rather than the other way around. Is that what you would say, Shane?
So here's what I would say is I think that bidirectional piece is important simply because at that point in time, I think that we're talking about maybe some behaviors that are kind of normalized within a culture and not culture specific or culturally important aspects, right? I think there's a difference between like, what is considered a social norm versus like something that is maybe more culturally relevant or necessary, right? So like for example, I guess I would go back to like a religion example for that. Where it's like, this is a practice in my religion. I happen to be at this other church. I'm not going to change my religious practices because that's the norm in this church. I still have my beliefs and my systems. I think that's a bigger thing to tackle than say like, hey, this is a more appropriate social behavior within this context. Like, and I think that's probably the piece that's difficult for people to parse out is like, at what point in time do we identify behaviors that are more like social norms and more that are like culturally important behaviors?
I see. So there is a distinction. Yeah.
That's what I would say.
You don't have to raise your hand, man. You just talk.
Yell at us.
So I'm just trying to acculturate here.
All right.
So, I think that we have to look at then what are the consequences, what's the function of this behavior, right? So if they are doing this and talking loudly because they want to participate in the classroom setting, and we're punishing participation behavior by giving them a detention or suspending them from school, what are we doing? What's the end result of that, right? So we need to look at the function of the behavior, and that's why we need to be aware. We need to understand this is why they're doing it, so we can appropriately provide interventions that are going to change that behavior so acculturation can happen appropriately.
And I think that's your example is great because I think it sheds light on the distinction between the way someone with a behavioral point of view would approach some of these problems versus someone with a more conventional either mental health and or educational perspective. Just because in lieu of what we do, the level of analysis that we do and the way that we collect information would just automatically lend itself and require us to have those variables because without them, you just can't make informed decisions. So then the real question is, like for me, part of like why I struggle with some of this stuff is that like I read it and I'm like, this is my practice. I can't it doesn't even compute to me that I'm thinking of it in terms of understanding a cultural perspective. It's more like my job is to break down who this person is, have all the variables that I need about them, and this is just one other data point that matters. And I don't think about it in terms of a cultural context or like the gravity of it in terms of identity, so to speak. It's just another variable in the algorithm. Yeah. Where if you are in a classroom setting like you're talking about, they don't really give a shit about that stuff. And it is about the teacher's way or the highway and the way that the rules are, blah, blah, blah. Or if, like you were talking about the doctors, like it's the medical science. I don't give a shit about your feelings. Like surgeons are, you know what I mean? Sociopaths. So, I mean, like you have these like, different distinctions, I think, from disciplines where it's like some of the stuff sometimes feels a little bit to me like preaching to the choir a little bit excessively. And I think that's where, if I were to levy an objection to it, that would be kind of my one thing I'd point. I'm like, I don't know, but sorry, Shane, go ahead, bud.
No, as I say, so like, is the argument that like what, like, we're already accounting for that because we are taking a functional contextual approach to all of these things like that. So that's the argument that we would make. So, and to kind of not, I wouldn't even say counterpoint that. I think that, I think we all have that functional contextual approach, but I think that understanding how, within a system that we're working in, how things like race and gender and sexual orientation, how that influences decision making from a systemic point of view. Like, I'm reading like, going back to the data, going back to the Larry P versus Larry P. Yeah, going back to
This Measure of a Man. You should read this. This is for anyone listening. Back to when Oneida was talking about the different measures and stuff. This is a book that was written by Stephen Jay Gould, and it was written as a response to the bell curve. And if you don't know what the bell curve is, it's pretty much a book that was written by a couple of guys. One of them is a guy named Charles Murray, it's basically used by white supremacists and neo-Nazis to turn people. But anyway, like this book is a breakdown of all the erroneous and variety of different biases that are put into psychometrics.
Yeah.
And it actually breaks each one of them down individually, and it goes through the measures in and of themselves. So it's an objective take on it too. It's not just from an anthropological perspective. It actually looks at the way that the quantifying of the variety of different things that they do comes out just wrong because of the different variables that they use to build them out of the gate. So it's a good book, very fascinating if you're interested in this. It's called The Mismeasure of Man, Stephen Jay Gould.
Well, and like, and I mean, I think that's important stuff, right? Like that's information about like how systems work and influences stuff. But I think the other side too is going back to the court case and like looking at the data, like it's a socially significant problem. Like when you come into like culturally relevant variables, like you can categorize these things as like, okay, blacks and Hispanic people, like Latinx people are disproportionately arrested, and like I mean, look at prison systems, look at forensics, look at things like suicide rates among transgender people. Like to me, those are socially significant problems. Like those are problems, right? And those are behavioral problems that can be addressed in some way. And like as we start looking at that and we start going down that rabbit hole, that's when we start finding those contextual variables that influence those types of things, I think.
Yeah.
I think also if you look at it at a more micro level, at like our traditional setting, you have to understand the buy-in component from the stakeholders, right? And so yes, we may be thinking of it as, well, I'm doing my due diligence because I'm following my science. However, the caregivers are not receiving it that way because you're missing the mark. I think one example that I will never forget is when I moved to California, I was more exposed to an Asian population where taking your shoes off before you entered an individual's home was very important. And I, as an individual who was staffing cases, would put probably my best RBTs, my best analysts in those homes, and I would still get phone calls of parents telling me how offended they were by these individuals, right? They were offended, and I was like, but why? They're so polite, they're so sweet, I'm not understanding what's going on. Tell me, explain to me what's going on. What is it that they're doing that's offending you? Obviously, I was able to get down to the point they weren't taking off their shoes after the parents have told them several times to do that, and it was extremely offensive to them culturally. Now, flip that, right, because we're talking both directions. I was getting phone calls from those providers as well. These parents there's just no buy-in from them. They don't want to do anything that I'm recommending. They tell me yes, yes, yes when I'm there. However, when I leave, the RBT is telling me that they're not doing what I told them to do. They're not collecting data. They're not, you know what I mean? They're not addressing the behaviors the way I said they should. Why is this happening? Why was this happening? Well, me understanding that I didn't understand those cultures very well, I called a colleague of mine and basically talked it through with them. This is going on. I'm not sure what the issues are. Should I pull them? What do you think I should do? They explained to me that this was a Japanese family, that in Japanese culture, it is impolite to say no. You are to say yes and agree, and then you go and do whatever you want to do. So my therapist, my staff was getting offended. They were getting offended because of a lack of information about the culture, because of a lack of I'll take blame for that, because of lack of proper training, right? So I took that information and I had to then educate my staff and also explain in a way that the families understood why my staff was acting the way that they were, so that they could better work with each other. They were doing everything else as they should. They were completing fidelity checks, but you know what? Fidelity checks didn't take culture into account. They were, they were going by the behavior plan they had made. They made these decisions with the families. The families agreed, but they really didn't.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I had a student, supervisee from China that was like, he told me flat out, like, a lot of like Chinese folks will put teachers and professors on a pedestal, and on such a pedestal that like a teacher can say anything and everything, and that person will just be like, yeah, okay, I'm going to honor this person's request. And like, to the point where, like he said, it can be a detriment for some people. Like, it can be like this unique social contingency that has the possibility of being a detriment to that person following those rules. And like, I mean, it's such a it's like such an intensely rule governed situation. I'd never heard anything like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, to me, again, that's the setting that most of us are in. And even though we're following our science, we're missing those key points because of cultural insensitivity.
Yeah. I mean, I've never seen Ryan take his shoes off anywhere.
You're
Thank
so
God.
rude. Well,
So
you know
rude.
what? It's offensive in my house if you take off your shoes. I'll say that. If you walk in and you take off your shoes, we're kind of like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around Ryan. I've been around people who have been around Ryan taking off his shoes, and they say it's offensive.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in my office with my shoes off and just my socks on right now, by the way.
It is rough.
No pants. The camera's above the chest.
Yeah. Talk about a privileged job.
Yeah.
My culture is underpants at home, so you better live. How hilarious would that be? Man, if we would have had people come into my house growing up, they would have walked into my dad in a recliner in tighty whities and a wife beater level like shirt situation with stains with zero fucks. And that is normal. So yeah, I guess that would have been pretty weird for them.
Yeah, I was gonna say too. I love those people that are like that will kind of create like a culture or create like a norm just to be sarcastic assholes. Like, have you followed anything about Pastafarians?
No, what is this?
No.
Oh, it's so great. So this group of people figured out how they can wear colanders on their head. So when they go take their driver's license pictures, that they're wearing like steel colanders on their head. And they created this religion called Pastafari. They're Pastafarian, and they worship a spaghetti monster in the sky. So like they created this whole thing. It's just like just to be like to troll people as like part of like this, like, hey, this is important for us. So I don't know. I think it's so great.
I've heard of something like that. Only they call themselves the Church of Joe.
That may be similar. It may be the Church of Joe. That's
Or Bob. I'm sorry, the Church of Bob. Bob.
Huh. Stuff to Google after this.
Yeah, Church
Right?
of Bob.
I need to write notes.
Danielle, we have a wonderful person, Danielle, that helps us with the show notes. And I know right now she's like, what is this? Do I need to include this?
I looked up Church of Bob, Dimitri. What the fuck?
Oh, we love you, Danielle.
I think we could, again, looking at what most of us do, I don't know if I sent this to you guys, but it's the assessment and treatment of autism spectrum disorder by Rock and Bush.
Yeah.
So
Did I send that to you guys?
there's a few things. I believe so. Let me see.
The article had a list of them, actually. There was like 5 different types of cultural interviews you could do.
Yeah, Bush, Roche and Bush.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roche, Rock.
Roach is how I've heard it say before, but
Roach?
I don't know if that is correct because I've never
I don't
heard the
know.
presence of the person. So, yeah, there's a few articles, I guess. Can we, before we hit that one, would it be cool if we just make sure we covered all the points in the developing cultural awareness
Oh,
skills?
yeah.
Yeah. So
So,
what's the
Where
process
are
we
we?
should follow then?
so
What's a good practice? What's a good guideline to make sure that you're like practicing cultural awareness? What are some good guidelines?
I highlighted some of their points
Yeah.
that they made. So this was written in 2016, Behavior Analysis and Practice, calling out many things we've talked about on just kind of a lack of a training around this and focus on it. There's a few different strategies. One of them, which Anita described how she went about in California with the talking to other professionals. That's something that I feel like is a quite easy strategy to implement, right? Like, first of all, just start talking about your cases with other professionals. They talked about some self-assessments, processes when it comes to values, as well as straight up collecting data, which I thought was an interesting one and kind of goes back to what you were talking about, Dimitri, on like we have to look at those. I actually got into the weeds a little bit. I dug into some of the resources and found that this isn't the first time this has necessarily been talked about. Not surprised, but there was an article called "If Behavioral Principles Are Generally Applicable, Why Is It Necessary to Understand Cultural Diversity?" And in that, they're arguing that, yes, we can do a bunch of these things to get some awareness, but it's still, their quote is, this doesn't mean that any degree of knowledge about group memberships and the characteristics of those groups, no matter how detailed, can substitute for functional analysis when working with a given individual. To miss this point is to engage in a new form of prejudice. And so, I don't know, I felt like reading out of that article is really taking a good look at your system that you're in, and what measures do you have that are either being used to assess whether or not you are providing treatment the correct way, but also really understanding not only who you're providing services to, but who in your organization is providing those services, and do they understand who they're providing services to? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like it's
one question that came up in my head while I've been thinking about this a lot more critically is, at what point in time does doing research or learning about someone's culture in order to better interact with them before you really get to know them as an individual, at what point does that become feeding into stereotypes? And like, where do you find the balance between those two things? Because even within a particular culture identity, let's just take the ethnic example, because that's seems to be the easiest one to make examples against, or I mean, like, you know, related to, what at some point in time, I'm going to say, okay, this culture does this, so people of this culture do that, but not all people of this culture do that. So what point is it then a bias that I'm coming into assuming that these people engage in a particular shared behavior or activity or belief system or belief within a particular system? And then that's an overgeneralization. Like, what is the happy median that you approach these things with? And is it possible that you go down too much of a rabbit hole where you kind of like build in soft bigotry in an attempt to be sensitive?
So I think personally that behavior analysts are better equipped to deal with that question more than anybody else. I think that we spend so much of our time being trained on individual functional approaches to things that I think that what ends up happening is the opposite. I think that culture gets washed out. And then you have like, and not in a, I wouldn't even say in a bad way, but I think it is something that like we tend to neglect that because we forget that that's a possible variable. So, you know, we have this functional contextual approach, this individualized approach. And I think that we as behavior analysts tend to benefit from that training. But I mean, I could see this being an issue in other areas where it's like, okay, so now we've got all these discrete categories, right? Like, you know, here's what Black people do, and here's what Mexican people do, and here's what, you know, transgender people do, or whatever group you decide to create.
Group.
Yeah. And then now it's like, okay, now here's this, you know, this rigid set of behaviors and rigid set of social norms that come along with that. And I think that, yeah, I would say outside of that, that's the challenge. Like, you know, to me, I think the best thing that was helpful for me was understanding my own, like where I fit in that space. There's some good books around that. Like there's a book right now called White Fragility, which is a really very angry book, but also like a really good kind of introspective way in getting white people to talk about racism in a really important and meaningful way. So I would recommend everybody checking that out, just as like just kind of having that in your back pocket. Because I think that understanding where your learning history comes from and what you are walking in with is a really great way to kind of check yourself before it causes some accidental issues.
Is it oh no, this book's called White. Bret Easton Ellis.
So Bret Easton Ellis, that book is more of his social commentary about like why he thinks social justice warriors are a problem. So, and he also wrote American Psycho. So he's not really, the most PC type of person.
Really?
Okay.
Oh, he was anti-SJW guy. He was on.
He's not anti-SJW. He's more like anti everybody being super sensitive about stuff.
Oh.
So that book is all about that. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard it's kind of like, can everybody just come to the table and have a conversation? That's a lot of his perspective. But no, it's called White Fragility, and it's by Robin something or other. And it just kind of talks about like why white people struggle with talking about it, because when, like understanding that our system in the United States is based on some pretty heinous racial stuff. That's a problem, right? Like we have to be able to recognize that to have those conversations. So I don't know. Personally, that was the most helpful thing for me. And also recognizing that things like growing a mustache is a privilege or was considered a privilege, or growing up with books on your shelf is like considered a privilege in some places. So
can we define privilege for the class? Right.
Yes. So my understanding of privilege is more like this basically these allowances that kind of give you these advantages, and you're born with them. They're things that you cannot help. You can't control. I can't control that I was born white. I can't control that I was born male. I can't control that I was cisgender. But I do benefit from those things. I benefit from being a male in the United States because it is a male-centric country. I benefit from being white in the United States because it is a white-centric country. I mean, and you can see the data that supports that type of thing. So that's what privilege kind of talks about, is those things that you're born with, those allowances that you're born with that kind of give you a leg up over other groups of people.
Does it make room for things that you've worked for and, in a sense, made available in your lifetime? So you were talking about your parents working in the middle class structure, right?
Yeah.
And so like my parents, when I was younger, I had one pair of jeans. I loved that pair of jeans. That was my only pair of jeans. And I didn't rip my pair of jeans because that's all we could afford. And I was careful with them, but fast forward 15 years later, after mom started a business, got some education, my dad, there was a lot of things that went well for us, and that kind of changed that situation. Like, how does that fit in the privilege discussion?
Well, I mean, I think part of that discussion is like intelligence. Intelligence is part of that discussion, as being you have intellectual privilege because you are born with the ability to actually like kind of work through some of that stuff. And so it does allow for that space, but it's doesn't really talk about motivation and behavior. It talks more about where you end up on the scoreboard from the very beginning. Like, what head start do you have? And so while you didn't have socioeconomic head start, you had a male head start, you had a white head start, you had an intelligence head start. Like, you had those things that maybe other people didn't have.
I've been reading a book called An Invitation to Feminist Ethics, and the concept of intersectionality has been something that's been interesting to me, on how essentially all of these different privileges or lack thereof come together uniquely for different people to form your identity and your culture and who you are. And it's been useful. I guess I'm just sharing this all deal because I've been working through some of these questions myself personally right now, because I've recognized there's things that definitely give me a leg up in my life. Before, this was a thing that I talked about even in behavior analysis, like topics like this on this podcast. I always told people when I was describing my personal situation, like where I was at, that I've been afforded just unbelievable amounts of luck in being able to not have to struggle with daily things that many people have struggled with when it comes to personal mental health, behavioral health issues, my family situations like that. And I kind of feel like that shit happens now and then, but largely it's just hasn't been an issue. So I've been kind of exploring these questions, I guess. And I talk with a few different creators in this space as well, behavior analysis. And well, I find myself like personally lucky to be able to sit down, like ask you all to sit down on a podcast. I also have to take this and put in the 6 hours of editing and the 2 hours of social posts and like there's work. So it was that motivation behavior component. Like I'm still learning, like where does that all fit in? To this grand model of understanding all these situations, right? So I start to think of, we have our 4-term contingencies, 3-term contingencies. These other things play in, like how does this all come together, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid question. I think probably one that behavior analysts should maybe explore a little bit. Like, what does that look like? What kind of variable is that influences these other things? I mean, I don't know. I haven't really thought of it from a really like intensely behavioral perspective because I come from a clinical psychology background, but it is a question that's worthy of study.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I don't mean, I feel like I'm the contrarian on this, and I'm not trying to be the contrarian on this podcast. It's not, I mean, I typically do that. And but I mean, like, it's just, for me, it's such a loose term. Like, it's such an undefinable term, and it's so elusive. Like, how do you pin it down? And also, if we're talking about values of things, value is relative, right? So I mean, when we talk about the various forms of privileges, and then like they can become, again, just like identity, an infinite number of things could be tacked as privileges. What is the percentage of privilege up and down? If we would put them in a binary code setup, what's the +1 or the -1 that gets you to 0 or plus a lot versus minus some? Because I obviously, it would be absurd to say that there is a divide. You know what I mean? That is
right.
That is a fact. Like, no one could possibly with a straight face say that you don't have certain opportunities afforded to you or don't have certain opportunities afforded to you based on particular characteristics that you cannot control in your lifetime. That is absolutely a fact. I think my question is, what are the ones that have the most significant relative impact on that versus other ones, rather than just blanket giving them all the same amount of value across the board, because that's where I think that question is elusive. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle with it, because SES is a big one, right? So like SES tends to transcend certain other identities or certain other types of privileges in a way that it disproportionately impacts people's ability to get ahead in life. So if you have someone who is, let's just say, white, cisgendered male, but they come from a incredibly low SES background, right? Like Appalachian, right? Yeah. What is their relative privilege really than to say on the other end of a spectrum, say a person of color, but who also has low SES, right? I mean, their experiences are widely different. You can say that those people benefit from the racial privilege, but they still have a lack of opportunity based on their background, their geography, their family history, their culture, etc. That is debilitating really across their entire lifetime. And the other group is also debilitated across their lifetime. So at what point in time do those things come together or meet somewhere where they kind of transcend some of those particular disparities based on the overarching, I don't know, negative number that you get if you add them all and subtract all the pluses and minuses that you get?
I think that's the
$1 million question, huh?
That's a big question, but I mean, not being very scientific in the answer, you go back to that cultural definition. A group is shaped by the same contingencies, right? So you have to look at those specific groups. You have to look at that low socioeconomic white class group. You have to look at that low socioeconomic Black group separately, and you have to recognize that. You have to have the conversations with the caregivers, with the community members, or I think one of the papers mentions the cultural brokers of the community.
Point,
and so
brokers,
and they will help you identify what's more important, because it changes depending on what group you go walk into. The priorities change, right? They rate it differently.
Cool.
We've seen that too in whose study was that? Oh my gosh, I can't remember now. I'll get back to you. But we've seen it in a couple of one of the studies.
So
Oh, I remember.
Oh, do you? Go for it.
Yeah, so cultural bases of social deficits. That one, I cannot pronounce this individual's name. I think it was Prithvi. I'm not going to try. I'm sorry. I apologize.
We'll get it out to everybody.
We'll link in the show
But
notes.
yeah, it was a study completed in the UK, but they assigned they listed 6 different social deficits that individuals with autism had. And they had the different cultural groups rate their importance, rate what was more significant to them. And I mean, if you look at the results, it was clearly different across each culture. Their Black or Afro-Caribbean group rated using eye contact as the most important, where the white group rated it the least important. And that went across the 6 different social deficits with the Asian group as well. It wasn't just whites against blacks, but there's studies out there showing that we prioritize things differently based off our cultural group. So why wouldn't we prioritize privilege differently?
Maybe this will be a good segue into that other article that you referenced earlier before I asked if we can hit this, the one on ASD specifically. I question how good we are as just any human at being able to handle all of this information and be able to make these decisions forward. Because just the volume of the information. So when you start to look at data like that you're describing, mm-hmm. and the demands of our practitioners, I feel like this is something that just continually becomes unreasonable to ask our practitioners to be able to discriminate in every single possible way that they need to be able to help somebody out continually all the time. Not that that's an unreasonable thing to be able to do, but it's just an overload on the amount of requirements that we start to place on people because of just how many things need to come into play. Like this seems like an area ripe for technology to help assist us in figuring out what is the most important and kind of ease the behavior analyst role. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, are you talking about the singularity and having like
we're there, we did it, we got to
like if I have
robot takeover, we fucking did it.
I don't know what typical.
I
don't know what typical caseloads.
God, good work, Shane.
I don't know what typical caseloads are, but like when I was in Florida, I was responsible for the behavioral treatment of 55 individuals. I could not handle that. I did the best that I could, but I didn't necessarily, like I told you that what I was doing is I was deferring the entire cultural category to my staff to be able to handle. I wasn't even taking into account that factor myself because there was so much that I had to take into account for. And that was the best situation I could do is just lean on the staff in those situations. But that's not the best thing to be doing as a behavior analyst. That's what's being called in here. But it was just, for me, it was like there's practical limitations.
But I think there's a cultural awareness within that. I think that being able to kind of recognize that like, hey, this is part of where you stand and this is the scope of your practice, and being able to say like, hey, I literally can't do this thing. And here's somebody.
There's also not enough numbers not enough hours in the day, as I guess was what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Like focus on all these factors. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's where that's why I think it was why I brought up earlier the thing about, at what point do you just treat it as people being people and then talk and then try to operate at that level, because there are certain logistical barriers that come into play. However, what I would argue now on the other side is that like if you're at the point where you can't take in those variables, maybe you have reached the extent of your scope and you got to be intellectually and professionally honest about that too.
And I guess
like there should be just like 55 clients. Yeah, it's fucking like, even if you remove culture from the equation, it's fucking impossible for you to know all the variables necessary to adequately provide advice of any sort, or let alone treatment packages. So like, if we're talking about understanding how to intervene completely, you have to have those other variables at play. So maybe that's where we have to talk about what are people's limitations, and maybe it shouldn't be that wide. Now, I know that money always matters, and like that comes into the equation. You have to balance, how much revenue you can generate versus how much you have going out and all that other shit. But I mean, like, the facts of the matter are, like, at some point in time, those do matter. You have to balance that in somewhere along the line, or at least have the discussion in some capacity. I do agree that there's a translational problem even in this literature, where it's like you have an idealized form of what a thing looks like versus the messy version of it, of what it looks like in real life. And I think that's a thing that we need to recognize as practitioners that are out there practicing, where it's like, yeah, you're not going to do a perfect cultural examination of a human being where you take the time.
And they do offer
do an
some
ethnological research project, and now you know all about this. You know what I mean? No, but I mean, you definitely should take the time to at least have some information on what you're talking about.
They do
exactly. And I don't think that everyone is pushing for cultural competence, right? I think we're pushing for cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity, because it does impact your practice. Whether you have one client or 50, you're still if you're interacting with a different culture and you don't know just simple things like the language fluently, you can misspeak and miscommunicate the interventions. If you don't have the empathy of a single parent, or understanding there's a single parent, you can also impose too much on that parent as well. Or low socioeconomic economic families may not be able to get to get the materials, like you said earlier. Those are little things that not everyone is paying attention to. We in this panel, I think, are very aware and are reading the literature and are understanding, but not everyone is paying attention to that. And that's why it's important to have these conversations so that they can hear it.
I totally agree with you. I think what I was...
And that I think part of it is the break, man. The break, like giving people the break a little bit, and like not being so ideological, puritanical about it. Like it seems to be that the way the conversation is framed, I think why I happen to sound reactionary at times, even though I'm not, is that like I don't like the litmus test in the way that it's set up, where it's like if you're not talking about it in this way, if you're not articulating in this fashion, if you're not thinking about it in this way, you're doing it wrong. It's not really about necessarily doing it wrong. It's more about putting forth the effort to do it in some capacity, I think, at this point. And then at that point, nature takes its course and people do become just people. But you have to, that's where what we're doing right here, I think, helps disambiguate that, right? I mean, we're having an honest conversation about where people stand, where they come from, how do we think about it? You know, what does this literature look like? How should we articulate it? How should we discuss it amongst ourselves? How should we cut people breaks? I said some insensitive shit over the last hour and a half, like for sure. I know I did. Like,
for sure. I'm never coming back.
Good.
Shane's not welcome.
I knew it.
I
knew it.
I'm gonna make sure I take my shoes off every time I see
my own
Shane
podcast.
But I mean, like that's the whole point, though, right? Is that like we have to at some point in time cut people a break a little bit too, and say, okay, listen, you put forth the effort, that's fine. I mean, and accepting failure not as a character failure either, because I think in some of these situations, if you do misstep, it gets kind of translated on the other end as like a complete character flaw, as if somehow you are operating from some bigoted position or something like that, and like that's a scarlet letter in our society, number one, and number two. Most people who do this work, they're not coming from I mean, if you don't take the vow of poverty that it is to work in this work, you know, unless you are a good faith actor for the most part, I would imagine. So, I mean, for me, like I would offend the shit out of me just to have that accusation leveled against me, even if it's, you know, even if I did make an error. So, giving people a break a little bit and just talking about it in a normal way and just saying, hey, trying is acceptable, you know, is a big part of this, I think, that matters in the discussion.
Well, I think that's that cultural humility piece, right? Like I see people talking about that term cultural humility a lot. And I think that's exactly what you're tackling there is like, give people a break, help them understand a little bit, but like, you know, give them a little bit of space to kind of learn because they're doing the work. They're working towards that, like that space where it's a little bit easier to kind of understand all this stuff and contextualize everything.
Yeah.
If anyone's listening, looking for like ways to move forward, that article we've been loosely referencing back and forth on developing the cultural awareness skills of behavior analysts have things you can do personally as well as things that you can do at the organizational level that I've thought were like good steps forward to start figuring out how to sort these things out. One thing, so there's two places we definitely haven't hit yet, which is like kind of the training systems. But do you want to, Oneida, hit the article on the assessment and treatment of autism spectrum disorder? It was the Roche and Bush.
Yeah,
we can talk about robots.
Robots. No, I guess it just kind of addresses the family's perspective, more specifically Latino families, and I did want to mention that they are reporting parent burnout. They are reporting that providers are not necessarily developing treatments, in accordance to their cultural, what's important to their culture. They're also, mentioning in that article that they have difficulty attending sessions and getting, information about these services. And this is an easy thing to reference. I think it's really easy to talk about like language barriers. And the solution for that, right? Get an interpreter.
Which are not affordable, by the way. It was like $100 for an interpreter in Jacksonville for a family that spoke French.
An hour, yeah, $100 an hour usually.
Yeah,
minimum, right? Yeah.
Well, I know for a fact, like in California, if you're working with Medi-Cal, they provide the interpreter for you. And I don't know if all insurances do that or which insurances do or don't, but that's one step, right? Just helping the families find out whether or not they can get an interpreter to at least do the assessment before you hire an RBT on, or whatever your process looks like. But also making go ahead.
I was going to say, I did a little bit of work for a company on some videography and helping explain like what they do. And they carved out a role that was specifically for just carving out an entirely different service model for people that spoke Spanish specifically. And it was one of those things where they hit a point in which they're like, we're going to put the resources up front on this to be able to develop this out, because it's important to start serving this community in that sort of way. It was really cool to see. I get that not everyone can do that, but it was cool to see them starting to like design essentially a different branch of the organization because of the need of the population that was in their area.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of companies come across that, right? They come across a population that's really, I don't know, dense something other than what they are. And so they need to find those resources and make sure that when they're translating, they're not necessarily just using Google Translate. I don't know if you guys saw. Do you watch Jimmy Fallon? No, it doesn't. I don't know if you guys watch Jimmy Fallon. Yeah. So he had this little bit. I watch videos on Facebook. I don't watch any show in its entirety ever. And he had this. Anymore. Right? He had this game with Ariana Grande where they would sing popular songs that were pushed through Google Translate in another language and then put back into English, translated back into English. And they were completely different songs. Completely. Yeah. It's hilarious to watch if you ever have time.
I've used Google Translate while on the road in different places, and I've always been very careful to use it with people that I knew could help me sort it out. So we usually had somebody that was there that could translate, and I'd hand over the phone to the other person that could not translate. Like we were actually using it. And when we got that weird look from either me or the other person, we'd be like, hey, like, where did this thing mess up?
So just, little things like that, I think, do alienate some populations and some cultures. And it's not necessarily asking too much of the provider to do, I don't think. But it's helping fill that gap and helping, build that awareness and understanding. I think that
for this discussion, there's just not to totally derail the discussion, or to take the direction, but what do you guys think? You're shaking your head. You're like, what's coming?
Rude, so rude.
Fucking centaurs,
fucking
man.
First day I meet
unicorns and centaurs. But, what do you guys think about the BACB international announcement and the language changes in the?
Oh gosh.
Oh my God.
I figured that would come up.
I was waiting for it.
I will say that I wish
I know what you think about it.
A lot more information shared than what they had shared initially.
First of all, they did an entire podcast on it, Ryan. How dare you?
They did, but first of all, it sounded scripted and it sounded chopped together. I could hear the cuts, and I think that's not coming out of a bad place. I think that it's better than nothing, but we need more information flowing. The one thing that was most concerning to me out of that was the representative of the board, I think she's the chair now, Bridget Taylor, saying, had we even sought information gathering from our constituents, the BACB certificate holders, we still would have made this decision regardless. And that's the thing that really concerns me. That was stated in there verbatim. I'm not misquoting anything. And yeah, I don't know, man. It's
Aside from
like we need more. Like I don't even know how necessarily to react to it because of the amount of information that was shared wasn't enough. I feel like, but that's my gut reaction.
What do you
and also like what the fuck, like English only, like what the fuck, like sorry, I didn't like make that clear enough of like what are you thinking, and like that's where that source of like where's this coming from? I don't know. Like that wasn't answered on that podcast. I don't know.
It was answered. They did answer it. They gave the stat where it was like 96% of.
That's like that. That's not acceptable, though.
I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm just saying that's what.
But like how is that? How's that?
Why are you yelling at me?
I don't like. How is that acceptable?
So much, and you just use.
Sorry,
Mom and Dad,
stop for this.
But dude, it's just like
I love you so
I guess
much.
so. Some backstory. Some backstory to listeners. There is like I know a handful of people that are in that system designing that, and I know that they have the right intentions that we're talking about here.
Yeah,
like everyone has a good.
It's a huge misstep.
It's like
pretty fucking obtuse and pretty like
when you cite that information as like that percentage. I don't care if it's 100%. It's still probably not acceptable because our nation's demographics here do not represent that. Nor does Canada has a second official language. Like that was
America
just
doesn't have an official language, so. Anyway, let's ask our guests what they think.
I'm done. That's the cisgeo.
It's not about you, Ryan.
White
all right?
male gender's perspective on it.
Okay, thank you. What do you got?
I expect better.
Now that he's colored the discussion.
Onadi, do you want to take this one first? I feel like you have some strong opinions about it.
I want you guys to fight over it too. I want to see like.
No, I don't think we're gonna fight. We've had conversations, and I think that our values align, at least on this topic.
That's like diplomatic. Come on, say what you think.
I like this podcast because like Dimitri's just trying to get everybody to fight. Like
I'm not trying to get
everybody's red.
Listen, man. The truth matters, and how people really think matters. Like at some point in time, like when are we like putting down our professional facades where we have to maintain this ridiculous level of modicum? We could just say, listen, I think that's bullshit. Like that's, I mean, we're just people talking. Like, and I think it's bullshit for a variety of reasons. I don't necessarily agree with all some parts of it. I get like, it would be disingenuous of me to hear that announcement and say, I don't get some of the points they're making. I think the logistical and the financial piece alone, that would have been enough justification for me personally to be like, okay, the English
that makes sense.
I think is totally obtuse and short-sighted. Like that the language thing doesn't make sense to me from a back to why that's culturally aware. Because if we're going to talk about it being an American body of certification or like judicious body for what we do, I mean, it's uniquely American to not have an official language. So to only frame it in a singular point of view or singular language like that makes no fucking sense to me. Now, when they're quoting the statistics for why they would cut the international thing, and also bringing in the fact that the international certifying bodies that make it possible for them to certify have created a system of restriction where it's becoming almost unfeasible for them to do it without potentially jeopardizing the certification in and of itself.
And I think that's much more what's driving the situation.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Fall on the sword and admit it then. That's why I don't feel like we got the full picture.
Right. And you're totally right about that. So back to you guys. It's not like I'm not trying to shit stir, but I mean, I really think that it's important for like when we're talking with people, like you guys should be allowed to express your point of view without fear of retribution or even fear of like what the judgment comes with actually saying what you think. That's why I'm trying to get, like,
I'm just giving you shit.
Oh, dude, I take it. I love it. You're wonderful.
So, but I think legitimately, like Oneida said, like I think that the two of us align really well on that. So I think I have a lot of thoughts on it personally. I think that working with a lot of international students, I think it sucks for those international students to not have something to kind of back what they're doing. I think that's a bummer, and I think that but But I think from like an organizational standpoint, and having been out there a couple times and like worked in some of those processes, and like I get why from an organizational standpoint, just from a structure and logistics standpoint, how it is not manageable to do what they're trying to do on that level. Now, I think the other side is I think that I would like to have more data and more information on why they eliminated those second language or like the other language exams. I want to see that data. I want to see why they would even come to that decision. I personally think that it is.
Remember, that doesn't matter because the board would have made their decision regardless of those sort of things.
That's cool. You're right, but that's fine. But I still think even if that were the case, show us the data so that you have the people that are like being managed by you. They can, because we're voting, right? We're voting for these members. Like, let us see what this data is that you're making decisions on. And if you're not going to hear us, then what's the point? But, I think the other side too is like, from the, like I said, from the board standpoint, I think it makes sense logistically, but I think that they have a PR problem. Like that was a bad time to announce that.
Yeah.
Like, I will have that conversation 100 times over. Like Christmas Eve. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, not a good look. Like
New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve. Okay. Either way.
All right.
Bad timing.
Your
But like,
turn.
Yeah.
Was there anything?
Give me
Yes.
the heat.
I mean, obviously you guys have all said everything, and you guys are angry enough. But I didn't watch the podcast. I read, the memo.
It's almost the exact same information that was listed on their website.
All right. So then with that, I wanted to know, because they did say that they would help assist these organizations. Like, well, how were you going to do that is something I wanted to know. And I also, I just overall feel like it's a step backwards, I was at a loss of words when I saw it. I understand a little bit of the language piece, and then I don't. So here in Miami, we have an issue of, I guess our field is satiated with providers that don't speak English and only speak Spanish. And we come across issues when trying to staff families because we still need them to speak English as well. So they're not bilingual. They're just, they're great for some families, but not, it creates an issue with staffing, and it creates an issue with translating the information or the research and all of that to the staff. So I've seen that issue happen. However, I don't think the solution is to eliminate all languages. Like, I don't know if this is happening in other states or cities or whatever. I don't think, eliminating all languages and just providing it in English is the solution.
Yeah, that's what we were saying. I was like, man, at least Spanish. Like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you have to have Spanish at a minimum. And then, kind of like, yeah.
There's like 6 Greek behavior analysts, so I get that. But I mean, like, what the fuck? Like,
yeah.
And the demographics alone we're talking about, I think the statistics are by 2050, the majority of America is going to be Spanish speaking in some capacity, or at least
it's projected at
Hispanic
least
descent. So I mean, like,
there you go.
Logical for Spanish to be out there. But again, whatever, do you? I'm not in charge. I'm just some asshole talking on the internet. So
right. No, but it's disheartening because this is our governing board. This is who we look at to establish our ethics, to kind of establish the guidelines on what we're going to do. And we're sitting here having a conversation about cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity, yet our governing body is not really aligning with those ethics. I think that the APA directly mentions and addresses cultural needs, right? In the field, they directly address what's expected of their providers, yet we don't have that in our field. And furthermore, our field is saying, just ignore that. You know what I mean? Let them deal with themselves.
It's more of like an ideal and like a a virtue position than it is really a thing that you incorporate into who you are and like how you execute on what you're doing is what it seems like, at least how I interpret that from a PR perspective.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I got so damn emotional about it is I know one of the people in there pretty high up extremely well from like my early undergraduate training, and just to read that and then realize that you know these people have the same value sets as me. Like, how did this even happen? It's just hard to comprehend.
Yeah.
So we went down the BACB tangent. If we circle back around, if I can call that, is there things that we missed? I had one other thing that I was interested in y'all's take on, which was, I feel like a lot of times it's easy to point the fingers at the training institutions that are creating all of our practitioners. But I also recognize that they have a ton on their shoulders to be able to train. And I feel like this is another one of those where there's calls in the literature that we've talked about today for we need to focus on those training systems, on the supervision processes. Are we expecting too much there? Like, couldn't we just redesign this better? Is it time to redesign all this better? Do we need like a whole different level of practitioner, right? That's going beyond the 2 years of training? Because I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think it's a macro skill issue. I don't think that you can be trained in every single aspect of every single thing that you're going to come across to be like Oneida mentioned, like to be culturally competent. It's fucking impossible. So you have to kind of take a step back and look at like, what are those macro skills? So like when I was studying, when I was going through my clinical psychology program, like they teach you how to, when you go do assessments, you're supposed to go in and grab the manuals, read the manuals, go through them, get an understanding. Like we do it with research. How do you interpret and really read research? Like those are macro skills that are necessary to practice as a competent practitioner. I would argue that the same thing is true for culture, where it's there's no finish line, there's no goalpost, there's nothing where you're gonna. It's going to be one of those things where you're going to get to a finish line. And I think that having those macro skills is more critical. I don't think that that's up to the training programs. I think that comes into like supervision, and I think that comes into some other spaces. It may be worth having some discussion around that within our training programs, but I don't think that that's anywhere near where we're at.
That's way too contextualist of you.
How dare I?
Because I asked this partially because different points when I've read different bits of research, and I've not dove into this area extensively enough to claim this, but it does seem like a lot of times there's kind of replication of priorities and things we should be focusing on. And one of the articles linked in there, like I mentioned, was that 1995 article that says, if behavioral principles are generally applicable, why is it necessary to understand cultural diversity? And they referenced that there was an important trending topic that was being discussed in cultural in practice and in research, like in, what am I trying to say, in conferences and like that sort of culture at the time. And I don't know if it dropped off since then, but it seems like these things kind of cyclically come back up. And if it was such a big thing then, like what can we do now that it's a big topic again,
I think it's
to
just
actually move the needle forward?
I think that goes back to the pragmatic conversation and just the honest conversation. I think there's so much taboo around this kind of topic. And also it's very, again, going back to whole easily misstepped. Like no one wants to get canceled. Like that's a real thing. I mean, that's just a fact. No one wants to be that guy on the internet who said some really horrible shit by accident even, and then what happens there. So it goes back to both tolerance both ways, and also like what Shane said, I think the macro skills matter. And I think that goes across every possible area that we could talk about. There's macro skill deficits. This just happens to be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
It's definitely a big area that's the case. So yeah, I hear that. I don't know. What do you think, Conetta? You got any thoughts on this?
I still think that there should be representation like in the front end. I think that research should, consider those variables. I think, and this is me thinking, things drop off because, okay, fine, it's a hot topic today. It was a hot topic 20 years ago, but sometimes the voices that are speaking on that topic get tired, get distracted, are thrown a bone, right? And they kind of lay back and they assume that things are going to start progressing. And then they realize, wait, crap, nothing has changed. We're still in the same place. I need to step up again. The next generation steps up and they have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's ironic, I guess I'll say, that my grandfather recently posted, they did a special on PBS, the public broadcasting station,
Mm-hmm.
about the first Rainbow Coalition. I don't know if any of you guys are my friends on Facebook. I did post about it and you can see it there. But he was part of several gangs in Chicago that were trying to push political topics like cultural sensitivity for the communities, right? Cultural needs, things that were kind of not happening. They were trying to push for what they needed at the time. And in this documentary, they talked about how hard they pushed, how much they moved forward, and then how dangerous it became for them to have these conversations, how people were dying and mysteriously disappearing. And so these heads of these gangs just stopped. They stopped having these fights, even though they had moved forward. They had pushed forward. They stopped because it became dangerous to talk, because even in the professional setting, it's not, bosses don't want to hear their employees complaining about cultural insensitivities because they don't want to go to court over this. They don't want to be charged for this. So they rather just eliminate you. So it becomes dangerous to have these conversations. And I think that's why it drops off and it stops being a conversation. I don't think it's because it's a hot topic and it's part of popular culture. I think, again, we get brave people every so often that are ready to have that conversation again, or something shocking happens to, our community that wakes everyone up and makes them realize, like, wait a minute, we're sleeping on this topic and things haven't progressed the way they should. So I do think, we do need to look at things on the front end. We do need representation. I think kind of like what Shane said and what we've talked about before, nobody's asking you, not you, but no one's asking
proverbial
of the provider. Yeah, no one's asking of the provider to be culturally competent, to be, fully aware of every single culture that the United States is composed of. We're asking for you to be sensitive to other cultures and to be to actively, look for teaching yourself about these cultures that you're working with. It's just a basic form of respect, if nothing else, right?
Yeah,
you're going to work with us, learn about us.
I totally agree with everything that you're saying on that front.
Yeah.
What I also find interesting in our field with kind of related to the training programs is they reference in these articles like Gold Diamond. Another one that I referenced earlier was Cantor. I can't remember if I referenced it earlier or not, or when we were planning before we hit record.
Yeah, it was part of your spiel. Like you're like, Cantor and Gold Diamond, da 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 da.
Yeah. The thing is, there's these lost people in our field in a sense that they're not in the mainstream contemporary ABA talk and training programs, and there's variables that they account for and they talk about. Like Cantor wrote an entire enormous book on culture and topics related to this, and it just never, for whatever reason, made it into our training program. So it's kind of like we've been talking about these for a long time, and maybe even solve some of them in the sense of, rather than having a 3-term contingency, some of these people have literally like 12 or 15 terms, because they say, hey, you need to pay attention to the ecological variables, the context, the cultural history, all of these modes of interaction. And it's kind of like, in a sense, I feel like part of the reason it comes back up is we continue to not design, take everything that our field's actually figured out and put it into our training programs. We take the stuff that's sometimes easiest or the most in vogue or what's kind of being talked about, rather than stepping back and saying, hey, what's all the good shit in our field? Let's train people on that.
Well, that's
There's-
like even Anthony Bigland wrote that book in '94. It was Changing
Yeah.
Cultural Context, which is a fantastic book on culture, and it conceptualizes so much stuff. It's like this really cool green book. I was just saying, mine's like mine's right there. You know, for those of you who can't see it, I'm pointing at my bookshelf behind me. But yeah, it is such a good book, and people don't
Yeah.
talk about it. Like people talk about the Nurture Effect, which is a fantastic book. But I mean, this Changing Cultural Context book is a really great resource for anybody who's interested in anything that has to do with cultural context. It's fantastic.
One question that I think this whole thing leads to then is, and actually the cyclical stuff that you guys are talking about, is it just possible that there is no necessarily solving this? Is it maybe just because cultural contingencies shift so dramatically over time relative to the populations and the way that their particular contexts are influencing them, that you have to have the conversation over and over again, because once you settle into one norm that seems to be really relatively acceptably shared, then you have to change again because those things shift. Like, is the fact inherently that there's shifting going on make it an ongoing conversation necessarily?
Probably, yes. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I mean, like, there is no solving this problem. I think it's part of it. I think it's just the ongoing discussion has to continue always.
Well, and I think part of it too is that people, like as a general rule, and it's just kind of a majority, there are a lot of people who just don't understand or want to avoid the conversation to begin with.
yeah,
Like,
that's true.
I mean, all you have to do, a perfect example of this is looking at the Black Lives Matter movements. Like watch that, and people will talk about that. It's like you've got Black Lives Matter, which was an important movement about police brutality and racially disproportionate attacks. And then you have a whole group of people going, well, all lives matter. And it's like, yeah, you fucking asshole. Of course all lives matter, but if my arm is broken, I'm going to fix that. So like my body matters, but if my arm is broken, that's the thing I'm going to focus on, right? So that was the whole conversation around that, is like, you know, people don't understand what racism is. People misconstrue racism for prejudice, and racism is this systemic thing that people simply just don't understand, and they don't want to admit that they're part of a system that is inherently racist. Like, and that I think is a big part of that discussion that is constantly coming up. Is like, racism is a systematic thing. It's not like you just being racist. It's like this whole thing going on, and people just literally can't even wrap their heads around that piece. So I think we're going to continue to have that conversation as long as people tend to not have those discussions around stuff like that too.
Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking on the privilege conversation, right? The inability to wrap your head around racism comes from a place of privilege. Some people are exposed to it regardless of how they act or their behaviors. And, you know, we, in a very privileged seat, all of us should have these conversations for them, right? So that we can help give them a voice. Hello?
No, we're
Marvelous.
good. Marvelous. Sometimes,
how we end the podcast now.
Yeah.
sometimes,
Hello?
There's a better
Is
way to
anyone
end
there?
sometimes we find points and it's just a clear ending point. I think we might have just hit it.
That's how we do the thing. It's the marvelous thing, because
Yeah.
because apparently
Skinner's-
Skinner's last word was marvelous. So that's
Skinner's
Oh,
last-
was it?
He had a sip of water right before he passed, and he said, "Marvelous."